It's my great pleasure to introduce this session. Yesterday we heard lots of amazing results from research on behavioral issues. And today we're going to be talking about how to incorporate those into policy. And I'm really excited with the panel we've got here today because we have a real range of experience in different countries on different issues about working with governments to institutionalize the lessons of behavioral insights into the working of government. So Nadine is working with MDRC, which is the organization, I believe, that has worked with governments and done randomized trials with governments for the longest of any of the organizations you'll hear from today or see today. So we're really pleased to have her talk on some of her experience with the US agencies. Arianna Legavini, who runs DIME, which is the part of the World Bank that works with different governments around the world to test programs using randomized evaluations and other impact evaluation techniques, and has a great record of then influencing the policy as a result of those experiments. John Floretta is from JPAL, the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, where I also work, and he is now in our global office, but has had a lot of experience working with Indian state governments, institutionalizing evidence, but we'll talk more generally about the experience of JPAL around the world. So I want to start off, though, by talking about a challenge, which is of how to, as I say, how to incorporate behavioral insights into policy. And I've put with sort of a subtitle of when not to do an RCT, because I think you'll hear a lot today about the exciting work of doing research with governments, and that's very exciting. But it's also the case that there's lots of evidence out there which we need to start incorporating into policy, and we don't always have enough resources to run yet another randomized trial. And I think in doing that kind of advice, we face this sort of we're pulled in two directions. When we're trying to look at the global evidence and think, how can we use that to change policy in a very specific context? We're faced with two different, we're pulled in two different directions. One is that context really matters, right? You're working in a specific context, and you think it's very important. Things might not work out the same in Kenya as in Tanzania, in Boston as opposed to Chicago. So we think that matters a lot, and yet we also think that we're all humans and that there are underlying psychological issues, behavioral issues, which are common to all of us. Like, we all procrastinate, we all put things off to tomorrow. We all fall into stereotype, we all are subject to stereotypes. So when we're thinking about how to incorporate this evidence, I want to talk about a sort of structured way to draw on the global evidence that we know about how humans behave, but also understand the local context and really take that into account. And instead of seeing these two things as in opposition, I think we've got to incorporate both of these ideas into our policy work. And I think the way to do that is to understand that any one study is only part of a whole, it's just one part of a puzzle, and we have to draw on lots of descriptive evidence about the local context, our understanding of theory, of psychological theory, of economic theory, and incorporate all that into good policy advice. And I'm going to go through some examples that draw on a literature review that I did of over 70 randomized trials of health interventions in developing countries around the world. So my main example is going to come from a trial that I did with others in India with the NGO Save Mandir. And we looked at how to increase immunization rates in rural Rajasthan, which when we started with 3%, like only 3% of kids were fully immunized. And there were two potential reasons for this low immunization rate. One was that supply was very bad. So if you turned up, you brought your kid to the nurse, there was a 40% chance the clinic was going to be closed. The nurse didn't turn up to work that day. The other issue is a demand issue and sort of more of a behavioral issue, which is immunization is an investment we make now for benefits in the future. It's hard to see the benefits of immunization. So it's something that we think in general humans are bad at doing because you've got to make the investment today of walking your child to the clinic, the screaming child after the shot, and yet the benefits are far in the future. So it's a classic thing that we might procrastinate on. So we took the nudge idea and said, how about giving a small incentive to get people over that? So this is the results of that study. And as over this direction, we're seeing the number of kids who got more than one vaccination, more than two, all the way up to full immunization. And you'll see in the control, 6% of kids got fully immunized. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that in the yellow group, the immunization camps, which fixed supply, so absolutely without fail, there would be a nurse there once a month, you see a big increase in the number of immunizations getting at least one immunization. But very quickly, it drops off over time, so that the immunization camps actually didn't statistically significantly improve take-up of immunization, of full immunization. The nudge didn't actually do much at the beginning. It's the same as regular supply at the beginning. But what it helped was it helped people persist throughout the schedule, which, starts telling you there's something importantly behavioral going on. It's not that, as a lot of people said, there's cultural resistance to immunization. No, because, a little nudge isn't going to get over that cultural bias. Just having regular supply isn't going to get over it. Most people were having at least one immunization. They just couldn't persist through the schedule. And that's where nudging helped. Now, I do a lot of work in West Africa. And so the question, I'm working with the government there, post-Ebola, immunization rates have fallen. They weren't very good even before Ebola. Should I advise them to introduce a similar kind of system in West Africa? Well, if you look at this evidence in isolation, you would say, you've got to be insane. You've got one RCT. It was with an NGO rather than government. It was in India instead of West Africa. Context matters. You don't know anything about what's going to happen in West Africa. And I want to explain to you why I think that's completely the wrong idea, the wrong way to look at evidence. So this was sort of a very simple theory of change. We do the study, you do the program, you get a result. We've only tested that once. But if you break up the theory of change to the different steps, you will see that you can draw in evidence from many different studies. Some of that evidence is local, and some of that evidence is about we as human beings. So what's the theory behind why this program worked in India? Parents want to immunize their children, but they don't complete the course. They can access clinics, but parents procrastinate, and a small incentive reduces procrastination, and then you have to actually deliver the incentives, right? For this program to work, you have to deliver the incentives, and the incentives have to not be stolen, they have to actually be given to the parents. And that's all the conditions that we need for this program to work. Now, when we look at that, what kind of evidence we need for those different parts of the theory of change, you see that they're different kinds of evidence. right? So the first ones are about a local. Do parents want to immunize their children? May be different in different parts of the world, right? The second set of questions are about procrastination. They are about underlying human traits, and I would say we have a huge amount of evidence from around the world that we as humans all procrastinate and that nudges are very good at getting over procrastination. And the last set of things are about local implementation ability. And this is where an NGO is very different from a government, and India may be different from West Africa. So let's look at what evidence we have. If I'm thinking about whether to introduce this program into a new context, whether to advise a government to take this lesson from another country, what are the things I'm going to look at? Well, one of the things I'm going to look at is this. This is the immunization schedule and the percentage of people who reach it. And it's slightly stylized, but it's roughly 2 different countries in West Africa. So in country 1, you start with a very high immunization rate for the very first immunizations. And over time, with measles being the last one, you get a real steep decline. And only 50% of people are fully immunized. Now, there's another country in West Africa, and this is roughly Sierra Leone and Nigeria, or northern Nigeria. You get about half of people getting the first immunization, and that half continue. And half never get anything. Now that's telling me there's 2 very different things going on here. This looks like procrastination, dropping off, an inability to persist. This looks like there's some reason why that 50% aren't even getting 1 vaccination, right? Maybe it's cultural hostility, maybe that's lack of access to the clinic. I wouldn't do nudges here, but I would think about doing them here, right? So it's understanding the theory behind the program and then seeing if that theory applies in your context. And I think I'm talking about a development example, but I think it's as relevant when you talk about between different parts of the US or between, can France learn from the UK, et cetera. So as I say, there's other bits that are very relevant to context too, and are about, as I say, whether it was an NGO was implementing in India, they were an amazing NGO. They could get their staff to turn up. Nothing went missing. I'm talking about a government in West Africa, things are going to go missing. So it's going to be different. But do I want to do, there are questions about ability to implement. Do I need an RCT to do that? Is an RCT the best way to study implementation efficiency? I'd argue not. And in this case, we're doing a logistics pilot to see, can you actually run the thing? Does stuff go missing? And that's what I think is kind of the type of things that we want to complement our research with. And as researchers, we kind of always want to do another study, but especially working in an African context, there's just not the money always to do another study. So I have gone ahead and recommended immunization incentives in this very different context because I've understand the local conditions and think that they fit this framework. But I'm very worried about the last set, which is the implementation, and that's exactly what we're going to put our emphasis on. So in conclusion, I want to say that as we build up this incredible base of evidence about behavioral insights, and we want to take them into the policy world, we have to think of understanding the local context and the fact that we're all humans and some things are very similar across human beings. We have to see those two as complements and not substitutes. Global evidence and local evidence are complements and not substitutes. If we can think well about how to bring the two together. And so when we're giving advice, whether it's to governments, firms, or NGOs, I want you to ask yourself, if you're going to suggest an idea, what's the theory of change behind that idea? Do the local conditions hold for that theory to apply in this new context? How strong is the evidence behind the general behavioral change that we think is, motivating this program? And what is the implementation process? And can that be carried out in the local context, which is absolutely critical? So with that, very kind of framework ideas, and not talking about specifics, I want to turn over to the rest of the panel to talk specifics of examples of working with governments to institutionalize evidence. So John is next.
Great. Good morning, everyone. As Rachel mentioned, I work on JPAL's policy team, and I was previously based in India, and now I'm currently based with the policy team in Cambridge. And essentially what the policy team does at JPAL is two main things. One is to work with researchers and policymakers to set up experiments to test the effectiveness of promising development solutions, such as the immunization incentive study. And the second is more on the back end, is that once we have evidence from different contexts, global evidence, and we can match it with local evidence, is how do we work with policymakers to try to leverage that evidence to affect future policies. And when I was in India, one of the things that we quickly discovered was that for either objective, kind of to generate more policy relevance evidence or to focus on the use of evidence by policymakers, that we would do ourselves a lot of favors in starting these types of relationships and getting them to stick if we had an institutional relationship with policymakers. And what I'll say, I'm going to give examples for state governments in India. And what do I mean by an institutional relationship? Well, it's that we're doing kind of more than just one thing. So we have multiple studies. We're not, or multiple capacity building for evaluation, capacity building engagements, or multiple touch points on policy. It's something that is a long-term engagement, and it also involves different people in government. And so not just kind of one or two local champions. And if we can develop those types of relationships, then I think we would be able to do a lot more in terms of generating use and also generating more policy relevant studies. So I'm going to give an example. I wouldn't quite say it's a best practice yet, but it's the most promising example that we have, at least from JPAL in South Asia, of where we're beginning to build one of those institutional relationships. And so this is, what I'll do in this presentation is kind of cover the objectives of the partnership, a little bit of the architecture, and some of the key ingredients for success in this case, and some of the challenges that we faced as well. So Tamil Nadu is a state in India in the south. There's a population of around 70 million people, and it's a state that likes to see itself as a center for innovation in India. And so there's been a very good team of civil servants that are there, and a lot of the programs, social programs and innovations that have started in Tamil Nadu have been scaled up to other parts of India over the last few decades. And so they have a goal. Their vision 2023 is to be the most prosperous, and progressive state in India. Now, absolutely essential for us to build this partnership between policymakers, in this case the state government, and researchers, like the network of affiliates at JPAL, is we want to go beyond one champion, but we really needed one champion to kind of steer this through. And it so happened that the planning secretary, who's the head of the planning department, works closely with the chief secretary, the head of government, the finance secretary, and then the line departments. He really understood JPAL. We had worked with him in the past. JPAL is kind of hard to understand. So it's like we're a network of 130 economists from 40 different universities. We do randomized evaluations across 8 different sectors, but we're also interested in applying this evidence. So he got what we did. He knew what our comparative advantage was. And he thought that partnering with us could be a way of furthering what the government of Tamil Nadu wanted to do in terms of innovation in social policy. And so he would really kind of shepherd this partnership through. Now that's on the demand side. I guess on the supply side, in terms of institutionally from the JPAL side, we have a large office in South Asia, and we had the capacity to execute lots of ongoing large studies in different parts of the country. So at the moment, this conversation began in 2013. We were running 40 randomized control trials in 13 different states. We had over 30 affiliated researchers with JPAL, so 30 professors who are affiliated with JPAL working in the country, and those groups of professors were interested in starting new partnerships. And then in addition, we had a 10-member policy team who was dedicated for building these types of relationships. So let me cover the architecture of the partnership. We started off actually, and I think this is a little bit of a trade-off. We started off not with a formal MOU to develop the researcher policymaker partnerships. And the reason why is that though the planning secretary was a champion for the program. He was able to bring the head of the government, which is the chief secretary, on and convince him that there was a role that these outside researchers could play in helping to tweak existing programs that they want to make better, or to pilot new programs to address persistent challenges. But it didn't want to be something that the head of the government or the head of the planning department forced on the different departments, that you will collaborate with this organization. And instead, we wanted to have ownership from the departments themselves. So how this particular partnership got set up was that there was an initial meeting that the head of government had, and he brought in 7 line departments who were working in social policy, so education, health, social welfare, et cetera. And he essentially said that we were at the table as well, that here is a network of researchers, and they're willing to partner with your departments on both, the design of new programs or tweak to existing programs. They're able to bring kind of global evidence to this local context, and they're here as available to you as a long-term knowledge partner. And essentially left it up to the departments about whether they wanted to take this opportunity to collaborate with us or not. All he asked of them was to have 2 meetings with us. And so, just to give you a sense, this happened over about 8 months. So in the first meeting, we went and they kind of assembled the whole team, say with the health department, and we basically asked them to tell us what their key policy challenges were. So what challenges are you looking to address? Like in the health department, a big concern of theirs was anemia. What programs do you have to address it? How are they working? Would you be interested in collaborating with researchers to make them better? And we were essentially in listening mode. We went back a couple of weeks later after having discussed with our network of professors. First, we wanted to be able to share what is the evidence base for similar types of programs or to address the challenges that they're interested in addressing, and also to give them a sense of like what does the randomized evaluation in this case look like? What types of problems can it address? What's the relationship between the government and the set of researchers? And from there, basically what happened was we went back, and it was up to each department to decide whether it wanted to pursue working with JPAL to design and test different policy innovations. And if they did want to work with us, as staff members of this 10-member policy team, we did some work on the ground to understand their context better. We tried to match-make them with a leading professor in our network. We had those professors visit Tamil Nadu. And we essentially figured out how much demand was there with the government departments to collaborate with us. And then at that point is when we formalized this relationship in an MOU. And then the MOU, by virtue of having worked together for 6 or 7 months at that time, was able to get into a lot of the specifics that would be able to sustain the partnership in the future in terms of fund flows, how programs would be reviewed, et cetera. And so the rough structure of it is that each department would work together with a researcher to develop a number of programs of potential innovations that they want to start in their department and then also test with an evaluation. And so it was a joint proposal between the research team and the department. Now, once a year, the head of the government leads a steering committee to approve new projects. And so he will take an up or down decision to approve the project, and by approving the project, he's essentially allocating a budget for the evaluation. From the state government has a broader innovation fund. In addition to that, we're also trying to build a culture of evidence-informed policymaking and we didn't want to just have these programs be commissioned and then show back up 1 year, 2 years, 3 years later with the results. Many people may have changed. We had tried to find some way of sustaining interest. So what we did is we created a joint researcher government advisory committee. And the committee would meet once a quarter. And at first we didn't actually know what we were going to present to the committee because these studies were just starting. And as I'll touch on a little bit more, what we found out is that they just didn't want to be a check mark about whether things are going as planned. They wanted to know what we're learning from setting up pilots in the field. Do we have data from baselines? And I'll touch on this a little bit more, but this is actually, we purposely invited all of the departments, but there's other people in government who were curious about social innovation, who were curious about experimentation to have a seat on that committee. And so overall, this has been, I think, our most successful institutionalization partnership. We have over 14 studies ongoing in the state of Tamil Nadu. It involves a team of over 30 researchers, and these are international researchers from the JPAL network, also collaborating with local researchers from Indian universities. And the ultimate test of whether this is successful is actually not how many projects are being started. The ultimate test will be after some of these randomized evaluations are being completed, the hypothesis is that now in the advisory committee, when a program finishes, the head of a line department will be next to the head of the planning department, the finance department, as well as the head of the government. And it's based on the results of this study, what is your plan? Are you going to discontinue this program? Are you going to think about expanding it? But that decision, all of the key decision makers in terms of budget and planning would be in the room for that discussion. One thing that the government was extremely interested in, and is something that we were able to do, is that they wanted also not only to be collaborating with external researchers in India and abroad, but to improve their own capacity to do monitoring and evaluation well. So as a way to sustain this partnership, we've been also working with, they have their own internal department of evaluation and applied research. We've been working with them on evaluation policies and also setting up protocols to do large-scale data collection better. And I'll just wrap up on, this is several of the innovations that are being evaluated. So non-communicable disease is a challenge in the state. Over 10% of adults have diabetes. And so we have a program to inculcate healthy habits through different behavioral interventions. Similarly, anemia, high rates of anemia are a challenge, and that's led to a behavioral program actually to work with mother-in-laws or grandmothers to share information about the benefits of exclusive breastfeeding in the first 6 months. But this is an example of 4 of the 14 studies that we've started. I think some key ingredients for the success of the partnership. One is that this is not, often when government officials think about research or monitoring and evaluation, they're concerned, at least in my experience, they're concerned about someone coming in and telling them all the things that they're doing wrong. And so almost seeing it as an audit, an ex post audit. So this was very much framed as additional funding that could come from the planning department that's going to be focusing on learning and innovation. Now, the additional funding was also absolutely essential, the fact that the planning department was investing its own funds, both to bring the government departments to the table as well as to our researchers. Because once you have the idea, you need someone to be able to fund the idea, and that's what this mechanism did as well. Half of the 14 studies were actually pilots. And so we didn't rush to lead to a large-scale study. We wanted to first, in these contexts, better understand the problem and also better understand whether that potential innovation could be run or implemented in that context. And I will say, I'll just skip to the 5th one, and due to the lack of time, is I think that in a way, we started the advisory committee because we wanted to have regular touch points. And we were really surprised by just providing kind of simple but accurate and reliable data, what types of discussions that would start inside the room. And if you imagine yourself from an Indian civil servant, you may have got into the civil service because you really care about policy and innovation. And if you're the head of the health department, you spend almost all your time looking at doctors who want to be transferred from one village to another subcenter in a different part. You find yourself getting engaged in lots of different administrative challenges. And so just being able to interject some evidence we found is really something that's really of interest to the government. So here's just a small example of that, where the government of India is rolling out a big campaign to build toilets across the country as a way to combat open defecation, to improve sanitation. So half of all the world's open defecation happens in India. And so when we were beginning to design a study about how we could reduce it, this was just a very simple graph that led to, we're looking to the government to help us, give us advice of what programs could address open defecation. But they didn't even have, this just comes from a 900 households, a 900 person survey, but they didn't even have basic data about that. Even though that 52% of individuals who have access to latrines still defecate in the open. And so it's something that challenged the basic principles of what the programs that they've been implementing were, and opened up really the opportunity to have conversations about what we might test together. And so these types of just regular touch points where we're able to bring in data have been extremely beneficial. And so where does this go from here? We've built similar institutional partnerships with the Indian states of Rajasthan, Delhi, and Jharkhand. In the last one with Jharkhand, we were able to bring in evidence from other contexts of India to scale up programs without an evaluation in terms of a remedial education program, which will reach 680,000 students this next year. And we're taking this institutionalization approach. Particularly our Latin America office is interested in building these types of partnerships. So particularly in Peru with the Ministry of Education, we have set up a lab there, but also exploring relationships in Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. So thank you very much for your time to be able to share this case study.
Rachel said in the introduction, we are going from the international context, Africa and India, back to the US with my presentation. So those of you whose passports are not updated, don't worry, you'll relate to everything I'm about to say. So my name is Nadine Deshose. I am a researcher at a social policy research firm called MDRC. And I want to share with you some thoughts about on the topic of institutionalizing experimentation and policymaking from two of our large-scale behavioral insights projects. Yes, so as I was saying, so we will, what I want to share is some reflections from doing these behavioral insights projects in American government settings through projects that were funded by the Administration for Children and Families. And my way into this topic is to ask the question, how can we institutionalize the process of continuous program improvement through the behavioral diagnosis, design, and testing format in government organizations? So the question, the question for me is, will the expertise and the driving force behind many of these projects that take place in the U.S. always be with a unit of behavioral scientists that are mostly outside of the government agencies that they're working with? Or will we be able to develop that capacity internally, and what would that look like? So we just want to share, I want to share the models that were used in these two large-scale projects as examples. Now, we heard this morning about the President's executive order to use behavioral science insights to better serve the American people, and I'm happy that I didn't totally reproduce the sections of the order that William shared this morning, but I want to focus our attention on this one particular section, because this is about the implementation of the order. And so it says, executive departments and agencies are encouraged to identify policies, programs, and operations where applying behavioral science insights may yield substantial improvements in public welfare outcomes, cost effectiveness, and develop strategies for applying behavioral science insights to projects, and where possible, do some rigorous testing. And to do that, agencies should recruit behavioral science experts to join the federal government as necessary to achieve the goals of the directive, and strengthen agency relationships with the research community to better use empirical findings from the behavioral sciences. So again, there's sort of an assumption there that a lot of the expertise will live external to the agencies that are applying these, that are doing these projects. So let's look at the models for bringing that behavioral expertise to some government agencies through the projects that I described earlier. The first project is the Behavioral Interventions to Advance Self-Sufficiency project, or BIAS. This was one of the earliest large-scale behavioral research projects funded by the federal government, although unlike what SBST does, which is to work very closely with federal agencies, this project, in this project, the agencies that partnered with MDRC and our partners in conducting these tests were states and localities, or counties. So the project started pretty early in the Obama administration, 2010, and just is finishing up this year. It was sponsored by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at ACF, and it was focused on program areas that receive funding from ACF. So we had tests in, excuse me, the child care, child support, and work support program areas. And in total, completed 15 field experiments with 7 agencies across the country. The other project that I want to talk about is the Behavioral Interventions for Child Support, Child Support Services, the BX project. This one is really just getting started. So last year was the planning year. Many interventions are currently in the field. It is sponsored by the Office of Child Support Enforcement and focuses exclusively on child support programs. There are 8 sites across the country, again, which will be launching iterative rounds of testing, and those started this year. So the methodology for doing this work, I mean, this is going to be very familiar to many of us because this approach has been promulgated by Ideas 42. It was discussed in the World Bank report. It's the define, diagnose, design, and testing method. And what this really entails is working closely with an agency partner to identify an important policy relevant problem, and then looking at the behavioral reasons why that problem or bottleneck might exist using qualitative and quantitative data. So, it does take some like facilitation and understanding of how to use mixed methods at this stage, at the diagnosis stage. And then in the design stage, there's again a need for some understanding of behavioral concepts, the behavioral toolkit to try to address some of these bottlenecks that have been identified. And once a solution is identified, it's put into the field. And at least on our MDRC projects, we always do a randomized controlled trial evaluation to determine if we can improve these outcomes. And so ideally, this process is iterative. So once you conduct your first test, you look at those results and you may find that seems like more improvement is possible. Put another intervention into the field after additional diagnosis and design work. So in bias, we adopted a consultant model to working with our agency partners. And this is going to be very familiar to people who are aware of the work of various behavioral insights teams and nudge units within the United States. So, this is where the team of behavioral scientists partners with an agency. Often there's some person within the agency who's particularly excited about the potential of applying behavioral insights. And you work closely with that partner and their staff in order to identify problems, diagnose and design solutions and test them. And again, it's the external behavioral scientists who are kind of driving that work. And the agencies are collaborating and contributing along the way. So in bias, the agencies were selected because we had identified some of those enthusiastic leaders. They were interested in behavioral science. Maybe they had heard about the 401k example or the work that the BIT UK team was doing, and they wanted to join in. They had the authority to change some practices and some communications within their programs. They also could authorize a randomized control study, so great partner. These agency partners did not get additional program funding, so really the resources to participate in bias came through the MDRC team. And as I said, the team took most of the responsibility for leading the behavioral diagnosis and design work as well as the evaluation. However, it's a close collaboration with a lot of back and forth with our partners. And so, most of the solutions that, we came upon within this project were of the nudge variety. So this graphic just gives you a quick overview of the findings, the impacts from those 15 field tests. And you see that, most of the impacts are in the 5 percentage point range, some in the about 11 percentage point, and then we have one test that had about a 30 percentage point impact. And this is from doing things like, as we have seen throughout this conference, changing letters, including more reminders, things of that sort. So I am not knocking the consultant model. The consultant model has, proven itself in many ways. And so just to summarize, what's good about doing the work of this behavioral insights work in the way that, again, most of the nudge units that we're familiar with do it. Well, first, you get into the field very quickly. So you can launch these experiments pretty quickly, and that gives you the time and the space to potentially engage in iterative testing. There's a low barrier of entry for the agency. They don't have to produce a whole bunch of resources. They can really follow the lead of the person, the researcher who's leading taking it on the other side. And the agencies get to learn by doing. So the administrators really do absorb a lot from this process and ask questions and make suggestions. And so it's almost an apprenticeship for your partners in the government side. But the limits are that you may profoundly impact individuals within these organizations, but there's no explicit mechanism, especially because of the lack of program funding, for institutional diffusion or ongoing testing. Not saying those things can't happen, but it's not built into the model itself, right? So BX adopted a slightly different, or rather quite different model for getting the work into the field. And I'm going to call this the embedded team model. So this is a more traditional federal project where there were grants available for the programs as well as for the evaluation. And so the agencies those 8 states that I mentioned earlier, they were selected through a competitive proposal process. And in their applications, they had to demonstrate some existing knowledge of behavioral economics, behavioral insights, and as an institutional commitment to the work. They received significant program funding for participating in this project in the tens of thousands of dollars, and in fact were able to hire dedicated staff, including a project director in the agency side, to work with the consultant team. And so the team, those behavioral scientists consist of individuals from MDRC and our partner organizations. We also collaborate with academics, and we've done so on both of these projects. And so we lead the technical assistance and evaluation component, but there's an explicit goal within this project of building capacity within the agencies and a culture of rapid cycle evaluation. And so what we are finding, although these projects are just launching, is that the interventions are kind of a mix of your more traditional nudge type interventions and more intensive process changes to choice architecture, or changes to what staff people do and not just what the customers see. So here's an example from one of the sites that I work on. So in our child support project in Colorado, we are addressing a very particular problem, which is that only about half of non-custodial parents make their payments on their child support orders within the first 3 months after the order is established. That matters. It matters obviously for the families who would be receiving those payments, but also for the non-custodial parents themselves, because they can rack up arrears and they can also be subject to enforcement actions. The most extreme of which is imprisonment, but the first is actually a driver's license suspension, which is quite a burden. Now, parents have to make their child support payments manually during those first 3 months. So they have to come up with, some way of remembering to make the payments and then going through the motions of doing it. And in Colorado, there are about 10 different ways that they can make their child support payments. And those 10 ways are really not discussed with new customers, non-custodial parents. What the system is very focused on is calculating child support orders and enforcing child support orders, but that part in the middle is not that much discussed. And so we thought, we could introduce a behavioral intervention here to assist parents with plan making and habit formation during those first 3 months. So this is an overview of what this intervention will entail. We're introducing a new short meeting that will occur after the orders are established. It's about a 10-minute meeting. And during that meeting, we will explain the importance of paying child support in full and on time. We've developed an infographic that has your green, yellow, red visual cues so that people understand the consequences of non-payment and what to do if they, say, fall into the yellow zone and can't make their payments on time. We then help customers select a method of payment using a decision tree that is programmed into a website. It's a very scalable solution for the state. And then help parents fill out a wallet card with key information that they can take home with them. And then in those 3 months after that meeting, they're going to get personalized text messages. These can be sent out in an automated fashion through the state, and additional follow-up if needed. This is an example of the wallet card that folks will be taking home with them. And I put it up here just to show that, there are behavioral concepts that are embedded into this plan-making tool that people will keep. For example, the first line of it, I'm sure you can't read this, but it says for. So instead of labeling your child support payment by the name of the custodial parent, which is actually the typical manner in which this is done, we're saying let's talk about it in terms of the child who you may have this affectionate relationship with. So we're trying to activate the parental identity here. Also, for example, breaking down payments from, the monthly amount due to the weekly amount. If, for example, the parent will pay weekly, that could just make the payment seem more doable. And then the second panel here is a calendar where they can indicate the days in which they're going to make their payments. And each of those other panels is a different method of payment. So they would check off the panel that relates to the method of payment they've selected. And the panel includes all of the key information for implementing that payment plan. So, I think I share this with you again just to discuss something about the intensity or scale of the interventions that are possible within this embedded team model. Benefits, you have strong multi-level agency support from the start and more staff who are being exposed to the behavioral diagnosis and design methodology. You have dedicated staff, which is incredibly important, who can assist with coordination, because there's a lot of work just coordinating these projects and collecting data. You do increase the likelihood that the solutions can go beyond nudges and that they will be scaled up once we have results. The limits are that it could take longer to launch interventions. You can have a longer planning period because you have more stakeholders, you have to build more institutional buy-in and so on. You have dedicated staff on the agency side, but they're not behavioral scientists. So the external team is still providing a lot of that level of expertise, and the folks you're working with on the agency side need a lot of training and support. And it doesn't in itself answer the question, this model, of how to make experimentation an ongoing aspect of program development. So some thoughts to leave you with about the future. So, I echo the point that I think John made about how important it is when we work with agencies to do capacity building that's not just about behavioral insights and how they might relate, like how do we simplify a letter or something, but rather also how do you evaluate whether or not any change you make to your program is working? Because again, these government agencies in the US have a huge opportunity to do a lot of little tests, right? Because they issue a lot of communications, they have a lot of interactions, but how would you assess the effectiveness of those service changes if you were to make them? It is important to have dedicated staff within these agencies who are working on behavioral insights projects. And those staff people have to be a mix of people who understand program operations and also who understand data systems, because you want to pull out that data for the diagnosis as well as the evaluation. We still need to address the issue of building the technological infrastructure to allow agencies to experiment with their service and messaging changes. Randomization, how do we do that? How do we build that into what government does? It clearly will require some technological solutions and not people manually, stuffing envelopes with different types of letters and that sort of thing. And I think that we will know where we are in the developmental or evolutionary trajectory of getting toward more capacity within government agencies when the agencies are asking the consultant organizations, those nudge units and behavioral insights teams, to provide them with different kinds of services. So not always saying, come in and do an experiment, test a new letter, test a new email, but instead saying, my staff have come up with a letter that we think is behaviorally informed. Can you review it? For example, we were recently asked to review a letter from a child support agency that had been reading a lot of these different reports, and they were looking to encourage non-custodial parents who had a driver's license suspension to apply for it to be revoked. And so they had redesigned this letter. It was a lot of white space. It had a nice big heading that said 3 easy steps to getting your license back. And the first step was read and fill out these 2 legal forms that are attached, one of which is called an affidavit of confession. And then the second step was bring it to a notary and get it signed. And the third step was, photocopy this as well as these other documents and then send them to us. So 3 easy steps. And that is, how that it was the application of the, behavioral insights concept, that they had gotten from these reports and so on. And I think that's where, again, the consultants can be helpful in suggesting if we're going to call it easy, let's make it easy. Let's realize that we're not just branding something, we're actually thinking about a process and how we can use behavioral insights to kind of make it as accessible as possible. And so, that would be the next generation. Agencies saying, hey, we want to create more reminders. We want to create better letters. Can you help us with those specific skills? So I will leave it at that.
Well, good morning again. I'm Marianna Legovini. I lead the research group in the World Bank that does experimentation across the world. We work in all the sectors that the World Bank is present in and across about, different numbers, but about 70 different countries. And most of my audiences are policymaker audiences. And when I talk to policymakers, I usually start them off with some easy questions that would set some facts straight. So this is my question to you. How many of you think you're below average as drivers? Just by show of hands. Wow! Okay, my usual audience, about 2 people raised their hands. Because most people are like me. That's me. I'm definitely above average. In fact, I'm way, way up top in that distribution. In fact, I lived in Brasilia, and one of my neighbors was Nelson Piquet. And I thought, just by osmosis, I'm basically as good as a Formula 1 driver. And so do 93% of drivers, right? You know that. Everybody thinks they're great drivers. Nobody admits to be, except in this audience, very, very, very rational audience. Basically, no one thinks is below average driver. There are a couple of things that nobody admits to, at least, being below average. One is driving, the other one is sex. But it turns out that this is not just sex and driving. 94% of professors think they're above average, right? And look at that. Most MBA students at Stanford think they're above the median. So this is a really, really, really crowded top of the distribution, right? Everybody's up there. And this is true of many other professions. So what is the fact that I'm trying to put straight? Is that there are behavioral biases? That's no news, right? Not in this audience. What I'm trying to set straight is that we just may not be as good as we think we are, and maybe our projects are not as good as we think they are. And so in my policy audience, where everybody thinks they know the answer and they have the right design, this is just to say, well, maybe. But maybe we have some space to work to improve our development projects. What is the idea of DIME? The idea of DIME is to capitalize on the World Bank billion investment in the developing world. We're not raising money for that. We are capitalizing on the fact that the bank has relationships all over the world, 24/7 across many, many countries. And it's lending money, so it does have some influence. And we are capitalizing on that to use those funds, those projects, as pilots for ideas. And through those, exert influence. Of course, we're using rigorous research, random controlled trials, and so forth and so on, behavioral insights, and the whole package. But the idea is not to do it on our own. So in the past, people would ask, what is the right level, the right number of impact evaluation that we should do it at the bank? And I would not be caught dead saying 100%. Because it's okay to be crazy, but it's not okay for other people to think you're crazy. But the fact is that if we are in the business of development, and if we are in the business of financing development, then we should be in the business of learning what advice we should be giving to countries. And what advice should we give to countries? Well, in the past, development agencies would go and have expert opinions, tell people what to do. They would walk out, and people would do whatever they wanted to do. Nobody likes to be told what to do. So the idea, the fundamental idea, is to actually go into countries and work on what countries, agencies, governments want to do, to build the capacity for them to discover their own solutions, work with us, turn around that bargaining table around, not having experts coming from Washington, but having people on the ground defining solutions, figuring out for themselves, developing all the local knowledge that then will elicit action. This is what we want, action. So I think kind of the big picture of this is kind of working through different spheres of influence. The first is the sphere of control. The sphere of control is very much working on specific projects, specific policies to generate local knowledge to elicit that action at the local level. But then, of course, we have a big program working with the whole World Bank or working with a whole agency on the ground. And then I need to understand something else, which is how to build the institutionality within each of those institutions, including the World Bank, to think about the knowledge that is generated and how to use results to affect a whole institution. And number three, which I call indirect influence, would be to work with other partners to affect the way they think, their mindset, and the way they do, in this case, development policy. So maybe I never get to 2 and 3, but I'm certainly going to get to the first control. Now, mindful of our overconfidence, the average development project is an underachiever. Development projects are way, way below their efficient frontier. Do I have proof for that? Well, as we're collecting more and more and more experiences around the world, we are able to affect results by 50%, 100%. Now, what development project is, up top there on the frontier? If we can, with very small interventions and affecting projects at the margin, we are actually able to change results by 50%. We're talking about effectiveness that is not really up there on the scale, right? There's a lot of space to work, and this is what we want to work on. We do not want to work on the 5% improvements. We want to work on the 50% improvements. So we want to understand what are the things that will make a huge difference. And here I call for this group, which is, this is not about behavioral insights. this is about having a complete model, very much in the way that Rachel put earlier on. A theory of change that tells us what are all the things that we need to affect to really significantly and substantially change results on the ground. So we worked, for example, in Rwanda with a big investment program on agriculture, a lot of investments on terracing, irrigation, improved seeds, fertilizer, etc. But as we walked in with our first of 9 RCTs on saving products for farmers, productivity went up by 50%. This is how I know we're not up there, right? The investments are not enough. We have to understand how to make them work. So, how to fix our average development project. Here's a short recipe. The first is to strengthen capacity understanding of the people who are actually doing the projects, so that we have equal partners in the discussions of what is needed, and eventually of what will need to be acted upon. Number 2 is very much a deep dive in the theory of change, the economic theory and the behavioral theory of an intervention, understanding what is wrong in the current policy design. Most policy designs are, for lack of a better word, pedestrian. They're simple. There is a lot of space to think further in each of the interventions. Sorry. Third, focus on data and measurement. This is not an afterthought. This is actually a central piece, and it takes a lot of effort. It takes perhaps 70% of our effort. Through the analysis of the theory of change, also an understanding of what are common failures, common linkages that are causal linkages that just don't happen, and what are possible solutions, and of course, kind of developing an idea of what tests of different hypotheses we can put in each program. And of course, measure program effectiveness to understand how far we have gone towards that efficient frontier. So I've been in this for a very long time, and when I joined the bank in 2004 to do this, and pretty much from scratch, people were not at all open to the idea of introducing and linking research to our operations to do better. And often people would say, well, what results do you have? And how do they affect other projects? And I say, I'm not doing this to affect other projects. I'm doing this to affect this project. Oh, no, the evaluation will take so long, will give us nothing for this project. And so I've become a little bit obsessed with this idea of monitoring the impact evaluation products, understanding how much we can, or we did, or can affect the process way before the results come on board. And also, and to do this, of course, we had to build the monitoring system, which gave me a whole different appreciation on the difficulties of building monitoring systems. This is really tiny and small scale, and when we ask governments to build big, large monitoring systems, takes years to do. But we've gone through that. And so we have started collecting kind of descriptive evidence on how these products, how the partnerships with governments affect the way they act. So the first part is building understanding and capacity of governments, so that when we, for example, open a competitive call, we want good cases, good, important policy cases to apply for our support, not just good researchers. We want the good researchers too, but we don't want the agendas to be led by research alone. We want to make sure that the important cases come on board. Let me give you an example of that. If you are a student at Harvard and you decide to do an RCT, your ability to select a large, big-scale infrastructure program is very tiny, right? Because it's very, very hard to do without having built up relationships, right? Doesn't mean that we should not be working on big infrastructure projects. Well, infrastructure represents about 60% of financing and development. If we don't do infrastructure, then we are missing a huge part of the picture, right? So we want programs and research not to just be opportunistic. Some of it will be opportunistic, but we want it to be reflective of the needs, of the policy needs around the world. So this was a fundamental idea behind kind of strategic selection of cases way before we do research. Now, we have invested a lot in that, and we find that if you do invest in policy relationships and capacity, you can actually increase the ability of countries and governments to do research even in very difficult areas. As we work with them, the first thing that we want to do is, as I mentioned, work through the theory of change. We find that in 44% of cases, the policy design is significantly affected by this relationship. In 37% of cases, not 37% of cases, as we work with them, the implementation pace of those projects increases by 37%. Most of our teams and researchers work on improving data systems. That number is 62% reported as 62%. 45% of the projects adopt A/B type testing, adopt solutions that were tested on the ground, and implement different ways of executing their projects. In 82% of cases, there are decisions taken at the end of the process regarding scale up or scale down of initiatives. And I'm going to give you some examples of this. We engage our sectors. We create partnerships with our so-called global practices at the World Bank, agreed on major knowledge gaps, then agree on case selections, have conversations with all the cases selected, meaning with the government partners in each country, invite them to workshops to train them, share evidence, and stimulate a conversation around their policies. We have done this very systematically in the last 2 to 3 years to open programs in every sector the bank is present in. We pre-test them, post-test them, to see whether they learned something. We find that there are significant increases in knowledge, specifically for the policymakers that knew the least about evidence. We then open competitive calls. 80% of the projects end up applying for support. And when they do apply for support, we send their expression of interest out, double-blind, to external reviewers. And lo and behold, their proposals are better than the average proposal that comes just from the outside. And so their chances of being selected through a competitive process now has increased. I call this an equal opportunity competitive call for proposal, where we put our clients in a position to compete for yes. Okay, 40% change policy design. I'll give you just one example of this. I will start working with the Tanzania Bus Rapid Transit Project. This rapid transit project was thinking about bus lanes. And they said, we're going to take the bus lanes to poor areas in Dar es Salaam, and the poor will benefit from it. Of course, we, as economists, know that doesn't work quite that well, because, of course, there is endogenous increase in land values and real estate values. People get pushed out. And eventually, those poor people are even further from labor markets. So that project changed quite completely their thinking around reducing poverty through bus stops and introduced a lot of thinking regarding linkages to markets for poor population in advance of the opening of the lines to ensure that people could withstand those pressures and really understand how to benefit the poor. In terms of efficiency of projects, we ran a non-experimental analysis of World Bank projects that do or do not impact evaluation. About 100 impact evaluations that had been completed between 2005 and 2011 and looked at, at disbursements in those projects that are a proxy for implementation pace. We found very, very large, we have project fixed effects, but very large increases in the speed of implementation of those projects. So quite contrary to expectation that research would kind of delay implementation. The fact that researchers were there help plan and supervise and monitor and the activities actually gave a kick to those projects. And those same projects, kind of, we suffer from a little bit of adverse selection into our impact evaluation portfolio because those projects, before starting the impact evaluation, were actually disbursing at a slower pace than the average project. Then, in terms of measurement and data, a lot of the results that we achieve are way before even the launch of the RCT. Thinking with governments what is missing. For example, in Kenya, we have been working with the Inspectorate of Health. The Inspectorate of Health does inspections of facilities in a very kind of non-structured manner. So we work with them to develop a measurement framework, understanding what matters for patient safety, went out, tested out the instruments. The government changed regulation around the measurement of patient safety. Only 2% of facilities, private and public in Kenya, have minimum patient safety standards. So this resulted kind of in an action plan of what are the minimum things all facilities have to do to reach that minimum patient safety, and so forth and so on. We worked 2 years before the RCT even started. Yes?
We've passed the end of the session, so
Right.
you could just
So, good results also on adopting new models, really testing different ways, for example, of distributing drugs and eliminating stockouts of drugs at the facility level. Adaptive designs, where the first round of RCTs communicates important messages to clients, for example, regarding male compliance with the policy of segregated female-only cars, that then leads to a decision to implement social norms campaigns instead of only segregated cars. Scale-up decisions, for example, a large-scale pilot in Brazil on financial literacy that led to a decision to introduce financial literacy in all high schools, in public high schools in the country, but also to start a pilot at elementary school level, which we have preliminary results now for. And the last two, which is basically understanding this idea of sphere of direct influence by institutionalizing and really creating structures within the World Bank as well as ministries to implement these type of activities on a iterative basis. Through that, really being able to affect not only these projects, but future projects, a whole portfolio of projects, changing the way we think of development, understanding really what kind of changes must be introduced in our thinking and our projects to move the agenda forward. Again, not just to change things on the margin, but really to change the way development is done. All right, thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure to introduce this session. Yesterday we heard lots of amazing results from research on behavioral issues, and today we're going to be talking about how to incorporate those into policy. And I'm really excited with the panel we've got here today, because we have a real range of experience in different countries on different issues about working with governments to institutionalize the lessons of behavioral insights into the working of government. So Nadine de Chaussee is working with MDRC, which is the organization, I believe, that has worked with governments and done randomized trials with governments for the longest of any of the organizations you'll hear from today or see today. So we're really pleased to have her talk on some of her experience with the US agencies. Arianna Legavini, who runs DIME, which is the part of the World Bank that works with different governments around the world to test programs using randomized evaluations and other impact evaluation techniques, and has a great record of then influencing the policy as a result of those experiments. John Floretta is from JPAL, the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, where I also work, and he is now in our global office, but has had a lot of experience working with Indian state governments, institutionalizing evidence, but we'll talk more generally about the experience of JPAL around the world. So I want to start off, though, by talking about a challenge, which is of how to, as I say, how to incorporate behavioral insights into policy. And I've put with sort of a subtitle of when not to do an RCT, because I think you'll hear a lot today about the exciting work of doing research with governments, and that's very exciting. But it's also the case that there's lots of evidence out there which we need to start incorporating into policy, and we don't always have enough resources to run yet another randomized trial. And I think in doing that kind of advice, we face this sort of we're pulled in two directions. When we're trying to look at the global evidence and think, how can we use that to change policy in a very specific context? We're faced with two different, we're pulled in two different directions. One is that context really matters, right? You're working in a specific context, and you think it's very important. Things might not work out the same in Kenya as in Tanzania, in Boston as opposed to Chicago. So we think that matters a lot, and yet we also think that we're all humans and that there are underlying psychological issues, behavioral issues, which are common to all of us. Like, we all procrastinate, we all put things off to tomorrow. We all fall into stereotype, we all are subject to stereotypes. So when we're thinking about how to incorporate this evidence, I want to talk about a sort of structured way to draw on the global evidence that we know about how humans behave, but also understand the local context and really take that into account. And instead of seeing these two things as in opposition, I think we've got to incorporate both of these ideas into our policy work. And I think the way to do that is to understand that any one study is only part of a whole, it's just one part of a puzzle, and we have to draw on lots of descriptive evidence about the local context, our understanding of theory, of psychological theory, of economic theory, and incorporate all that into good policy advice. And I'm going to go through some examples that draw on a literature review that I did of over 70 randomized trials of health interventions in developing countries around the world. So my main example is going to come from a trial that I did with others in India with the NGO Save Mandir. And we looked at how to increase immunization rates in rural Rajasthan, which when we started with 3%, like only 3% of kids were fully immunized. And there were two potential reasons for this low immunization rate. One was that supply was very bad. So if you turned up, you brought your kid to the nurse, there was a 40% chance the clinic was going to be closed. The nurse didn't turn up to work that day. The other issue is a demand issue and sort of more of a behavioral issue, which is immunization is an investment we make now for benefits in the future. It's hard to see the benefits of immunization. So it's something that we think in general humans are bad at doing, because you've got to make the investment today of walking your child to the clinic, the screaming child after the shot, and yet the benefits are far in the future. So it's a classic thing that we might procrastinate on. So we took the nudge idea and said, how about giving a small incentive to get people over that? So this is the results of that study. And as over this direction, we're seeing the number of kids who got more than one vaccination, more than two, all the way up to full immunization. And you'll see in the control, 6% of kids got fully immunized. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that in the yellow group, the immunization camps, which fixed supply, so absolutely without fail, there would be a nurse there once a month, you see a big increase in the number of immunizations getting at least one immunization. But very quickly, it drops off over time, so that the immunization camps actually didn't statistically significantly improve take-up of immunization, of full immunization. The nudge didn't actually do much at the beginning. It's the same as regular supply at the beginning. But what it helped was it helped people persist throughout the schedule, which, starts telling you there's something importantly bad. Do parents want to immunize their children? May be different in different parts of the world, right? The second set of questions are about procrastination. They are about underlying human traits. And I would say we have a huge amount of evidence from around the world that we as humans all procrastinate, and that nudges are very good at getting over procrastination. And the last set of things are about local implementation ability. And this is where an NGO is very different from a government, and India may be different from West Africa. So let's look at what evidence we have. If I'm thinking about whether to introduce this program into a new context, whether to advise a government to take this lesson from another country, what are the things I'm going to look at? Well, one of the things I'm going to look at is this. This is the immunization schedule and the percentage of people who reach it. And it's slightly stylized, but it's roughly 2 different countries in West Africa. So in country 1, you start with a very high immunization rate for the very first immunizations. And over time, with measles being the last one, you get a real steep decline. And only 50% of people are fully immunized. Now, there's another country in West Africa, and this is roughly Sierra Leone and Nigeria, or northern Nigeria. You get about half of people getting the first immunization, and that half continue. and half never get anything. Now that's telling me there's two very different things going on here. This looks like procrastination dropping off an inability to persist. This looks like there's some reason why that 50% aren't even getting one vaccination, right? Maybe it's cultural hostility, maybe that's lack of access to the clinic. I wouldn't do nudges here, but I would think about doing them here, right? So it's understanding the theory behind the program, behavioral going on. It's not that, as a lot of people said, there's cultural resistance to immunization. No, because, you know, a little nudge isn't going to get over that cultural bias. Just having regular supply isn't going to get over it. Most people were having at least one immunization. They just couldn't persist through the schedule. And that's where nudging helped. Now, I do a lot of work in West Africa. And so the question, I'm working with the government there, post-Ebola, immunization rates have fallen. They weren't very good even before Ebola. Should I advise them to introduce a similar kind of system in West Africa? Well, if you look at this evidence in isolation, you would say, you've got to be insane. You've got one RCT. It was with an NGO rather than government. It was in India instead of West Africa. Context matters. You don't know anything about what's going to happen to in West Africa. And I want to explain to you why I think that's completely the wrong idea, the wrong way to look at evidence. So this was sort of a very simple theory of change. We do the study, you do the program, you get a result. We've only tested that once. But if you break up the theory of change to the different steps, you will see that you can draw in evidence from many different studies. Some of that evidence is local, and some of that evidence is about we as human beings. So what's the theory behind why this program worked in India? Parents want to immunize their children, but they don't complete the course. They can access clinics, but parents procrastinate, and a small incentive reduces procrastination. And then you have to actually deliver the incentives, right? For this program to work, you have to deliver the incentives, and the incentives have to not be stolen. They have to actually be given to the parents. And that's all the conditions that we need for this program to work. Now, when we look at that, what kind of evidence we need for those different parts of the theory of change, you see that they're different kinds of evidence, right? So the first ones are about a local